What is going on, investors? Hopefully, you guys are having a great day out there. It is time to talk about Boeing Company, ticker symbol BA. The company just reported their Q3 earnings, and we're going to get into them. It's a really interesting company and probably has some of the most interesting financials that we'll see here on the Investor Channel. We'll jump into these financials. We'll take a look at the revenues, the profits, see how well, if you've been following the Boeing story over the last year or two, you understand that this company has been having trouble delivering airplanes for two different reasons. Number one, you had the pandemic last year. Obviously, Boeing's commercial airline customers did not need airplanes because they weren't flying a lot of people around. And on top of that, Boeing's newest planes have not been able to be delivered because a lot of tragic safety issues. And the company is still working its way, trying to work through that. We'll talk about that more in depth here in a second. And then lastly, we're going to talk about this company from a technical perspective. I tell you what, this is some of the most predictable patterns that we're seeing in a company from a technical perspective. And I think we're on the verge of either breaking up or breaking down on this one. And I'll give you some really specific price targets that I think you should look for with Boeing. If it breaks above or below certain levels, it could trigger a buy or a sell opportunity with Boeing. Now, those Q3 numbers, which we'll talk about in depth on today's show, those came in at $15.28 billion. That was up about 8.4% year over year. Now, it did miss the street expectations by about $990 million or nearly $1 billion, but the shares initially were up in the after hours, but we're seeing, I'm recording this during trade, so things can bounce around, but the stock is down about 1.27% at the current time. Now, here's probably the most interesting thing, not only from Boeing, but I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of a company in the entire stock market. Take a look at this, is the commercial airplane backlog over at Boeing. So the backlog is essentially planes that are on order over at Boeing, but they are not able to deliver these planes for a number of different reasons, primarily now due to the safety issues involving their newest planes. The backlog of that business is $290 billion. $290 billion. I will talk about that more in a second here. But what also was interesting is in the most recent quarter, they added 93 more net orders to that. So while they have probably some cancellation on orders, 93 net orders came in on top of the orders that are already sitting there on Boeing's books. Now, here's two ways to look at this. Here's commercial airplane revenue in the most recent quarter. That came in at $4.46 billion. Okay, the street was expecting about $5.3 billion. Let's split the difference and just say on an annualized run rate, Boeing does $5 billion worth of commercial airplane business in a quarter. We annualize that out 5 times 4 quarters, you get to $20 billion. Here's the importance of that. They've got a backlog of $290 billion. If you're going to do in an average quarter, average year, $20 billion worth of business, you have, yes, over at Boeing, over 10 years, 10 years of business just sitting in your backlog. Now, here's the other thing I want to show you is we've got a backlog of $290 billion. Here's what I want to show you too, that is just really unbelievable. You almost don't even believe this. The total market cap over at Boeing is $124 billion. So the backlog is over 2 times the market cap of Boeing. If that doesn't scream absolute smoking value stock over at Boeing, if they can get their S together in terms of getting these planes flying safely, which by all means, God willing, we all want that to happen for the sake of the passengers and the crew on those flights. We want them to be safe. If Boeing can actually get that right, this is a company that is probably, I mean, we're talking wildly undervalued just based on their commercial airline backlog of $290 billion. Now, that's not the full story. Look, we've got a space, defense, and security business that's doing about $6.62 billion in the most recent quarter. The street was expecting closer to 7. And then we've got service revenues coming in at $4.2 billion. That came over consensus at about $4 billion. Let's jump into these numbers a little bit more here. So we've got our total revenues here coming in at this here. This right-hand column is our most recent quarter. The left-hand column is on a 9-month basis since this is Q3 for Boeing. So we have these numbers coming in at, we'll call that $5.3 billion. Again, that's about 8% over where we were last period. at 4.1. For the last 9 months, we're still showing revenue growth here as well, from 42.9 up to this $47.5 billion. Now, the story over at Boeing is because they've had the backlog of business, they haven't been able to deliver planes for safety reasons and health reasons. The fact that their commercial customers have just not been able to fly customers out and about. We've got these total costs and expenses coming in at $13.5 billion. So you take this $15.278 billion, you minus off this 13.5, you get kind of gross margins over at Boeing coming in at $1.7 billion. You see, for the previous 9 months, they were at break even. Okay. That is because they just were simply not being able to deliver planes to their clients. Now, for the last 9 months, we've turned that around nicely. Okay. We've got positive $5.5 billion worth of revenue. Now, unfortunately, we've got other costs over at Boeing as well. We've got general administrative and research and development and a combination of some investment income or sometimes subtraction. That gives us an earnings or a loss from operations. Take a look at the last 9 months. You've actually turned positive to $1.27 billion. Take a look at where we were last year. The stock just got decimated because people were anticipating losses, and boy, they came in. Okay, you had $4.7 billion worth of losses last year on a 9-month basis. You've turned that around nicely. This is why I get excited about this backlog, and I get excited about this company's new airplanes potentially getting cleared and getting into the hands of customers and commercial airlines, because this is a company that, with all its struggles right now, is still turning an earnings profit, okay, after we factor in interest on the debt and some other payments. Well, this company from a net loss perspective is not making money, but it's just right there at the tipping point, okay? We're barely losing money from a net loss perspective, and most of that has to do with the fact that they're paying a hefty amount of interest on the debt that they carry, which we'll show you on the balance sheet here in a second. But this company is at a tipping point. Obviously, I have no insight. I am not an engineer or a rocket scientist. I have no insight into when these planes will eventually get in the air and get in the hands of customers. I'm just praying for the safety of people that it's done and it's done correctly. And once that happens, Boeing is like its own aircraft. It's going to be up, up, and away and getting up into cruising altitude based on those financials. Things are looking good over at Boeing, believe it or not. And if we can get past the final hurdles with launching their new aircraft, I tell you what, this company is very, very well positioned, and I think a screaming value from a market cap perspective. Now, in terms of their cash, they've got plenty of cash on hand, most of that to the fact that they withdrew a lot of long-term debt last year. In fact, it's gone down from a long-term debt perspective, but most of that just got rolled over into the short-term side, okay? Went from 61 down to 57, but notice on the short-term side, we went from 1.7 up to about 5.3, $5.4 billion. All things being considered, we've got about the same amount of debt on the book, but we've got a fair amount of cash here. We still got about $19 billion. It's down a little bit, but we've got some unbilled receivables that ticked up as well. So this is a company that's doing okay. Okay, from a financial perspective, they certainly couldn't. We don't want to see any significant hiccups over at Boeing. Okay, that would make them take on more debt, increase that interest expense as well. Now, from a cash flow perspective, we pull down essentially that break-even net loss number. Last year, we're sitting at losing $3.5 billion. This year, basically around in air from a break-even perspective. Now, we've really turned things around from a cash flow perspective. Okay, cash flows from ops still negative, $4 billion in the quarter. They've got to turn this around here pretty soon. That's why there is risk on this stock, and that's why this stock is nowhere near where it used to be. This stock used to be up at $390 per share. It's still sitting at about $200 per share right now. We'll talk about that more here in a second. But they lost $14 billion last quarter, okay? They did some refinancing here, down here. We did $11 billion in debt payments, but they did about $9.8 billion in new borrowings, hopefully at a lower interest rate. We'll see what happens there. But all things being considered with Boeing, things are looking okay. Now, the other thing that's looking okay for me is this commercial airplanes. Notice, look, last year we delivered $11.4 billion in the 9 months. Now we're up this $14.7 billion. Defense, space, and security, tell you what, this is a pretty steady business, man. You went from 19.5 up to this 20.7. Man, you're basically, let's just eliminate all the other business models, okay? This service revenue and this commercial airplane. Let's just bolt on another, call it $6-7 billion. You got $27 billion business just in this defense, space, and security. Again, this is a company with a $124 billion market cap. and its biggest business right now is doing about $27 billion worth of run rate on that revenue. Okay, that doesn't include our commercial airline business, which will eventually turn around. Now, from a earnings or loss from operations, this is why I put so much emphasis on the commercial airplane business, because off this $20 billion worth of defense revenue, we made 1.8. Off of the global services, you did $12 billion worth of revenue and you made 1.7. But unfortunately, take a look, off this $14.7 billion worth of commercial airline business, we still lost $2 billion, but it is a much bigger improvement over the previous period where we lost nearly $6.2 billion. So that is what, if you're going to buy Boeing, and more than from a technical perspective or from a trade perspective, you got to see this commercial airline business come back because it is critical to the company's profits. Now, I have a weekly chart over here at Boeing, and what I actually had these on here. It was really interesting. I had these on there from the last time we did a video on Boeing, probably about 3 months ago. And what I've noticed is a very predictable pattern with Boeing is this thing channels sideways and then gaps above the channel and then gaps up and then channels sideways to down, gaps up, and channel sideways, gaps up, channel sideways. So what are we looking for now with Boeing is a gap above. I actually have a red line in here at about $230 per share. You see here in the previous time we did this, okay, we channel sideways. The minute we put a green candle on a weekly chart, remember, I'm on a weekly chart. I wouldn't trade this on a daily chart because this pattern may or may not hold true on a daily basis. Remember, our time frame is a week chart. So every one of these candles is a week. So if Boeing is able to put up a green candle on a weekly basis above the upper end of the channel line, which is the top red line on all these channels, well, that's a very bullish sign, and I would expect the stock to trade higher. Notice that it did it here. It gapped up to about $180 per share, and just a couple weeks later, this thing was up at $240 per share. Did the same thing here. We gapped up here at about $208 per share, and just a couple weeks later, we were up at $270 per share. So I'm expecting the same pattern to hold true with Boeing. If we can get up above this red channel line, so right here, this channel line, it ends at about $220 per share. So you're looking for Boeing for a weekly close to get above $220 per share. That can trigger a buying opportunity, and I would expect this stock, if it were to do that, to go from about $220 to $230 and probably retest these highs that we made back here back in the early part of March. We would get back up to $270 per share. Now, probably the reverse is true, although this pattern is not showing it. I would expect the same true on the downside. You break below this lower end channel, which is about 190. I would expect that to trigger some selling on the stock, and then you're probably coming much lower, maybe into the 150s, 140s on that one. So that's what I see from a technical perspective as well from Boeing. We're looking for a break above 220 on this one on a weekly close. You get above that, and I would highly anticipate this stock trading much higher in the coming weeks ahead. That was Boeing. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Back again soon with more. Good luck with your investments.